Miles. And if you're noticing these shows on Wednesday, and of course if you're a patron, you're getting this on Tuesday, but the majority of you are hearing this on Wednesday. And if you've noticed, these Wednesday shows are a lot longer, and we don't have a bonus patron half because these are our Saturday free show. Now, if you want to take part in the Saturday free show, the best way to do it is be a YouTube subscriber. It doesn't cost you anything. There's links in the description wherever you're listening to this. YouTube.com/This Is Revolution Podcast. And, you know, this is another example of us addressing all the questions. And they weren't all Super Chat questions. Question that becomes interesting, or, you know, I feel like we've cultivated a nice little community here that gets our sense of humor. You guys are even shaping our sense of humor, I would say. So if you watch the show, yeah, I'm definitely cracking up at some of the comments if I'm on air. I try to hide it as best I can. I'm not very good at it. But these are the longer form shows. Last week, I think it was like 3 hours almost. So I was looking at the clock a little bit on this one. I wanted to cut it at an hour and a half, but the conversation was so rich that it definitely stayed on. In this show, this was something that Pascal had pitched to me a while ago. And he came at me and he said, hey, I'm thinking about having Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H.Rap Brown's, one of his attorneys. I know one of his attorneys and wants to have her on the show. What do you think about that? I was like, fuck yeah. We've done one other show with a former political prisoner, former Panther. Actually, 2 more shows, I'm sorry. Because we had Daruba Ben Wahad on as well. Also served like 20 years. And H.Rap Brown is a figure that's, I don't want to say forgotten, but, you know, even his role in the movie Judas and the Black Messiah is just mentioned once in the beginning, and then it kind of just goes away. And you don't think about the fact that, you know, this man is still alive and kind of rotting in a cell under horrible, horrible conditions. As you'll listen to the episode, it almost sounds like they're trying to get rid of him through just medical malfeasance. And it brought me to ask a question. I feel like it's either like one of two things we see. Either politicians in the state where these prisoners will try to say, well, look, I want to erase the wrongs of the past in this election year, so let's give a pardon to this person here, or let's prosecute this guy that's been running around for like the last 40 years that assassinated said political leader here. That like happened in Georgia some years back. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, are they just trying to like, you just got to get rid of the last one so we don't have to just deal with it at all. If we free them, we have to deal with it for like 5 minutes. If they just die inside silently while no one talks about them, So some of these were questions that are asked. You know, also, H.Rap Brown literally has a law made called the H.Rap Brown Law, the 1968 Riot Act. He was in prison for a time for allegedly inciting the riot out front of the 1968 Democratic Convention, which, of course, later it was found that the police instigated that riot. The irony is this law, the 1968 Riot Act, was the law that should have been used for the January 6th protesters. As much as we were saying on the left, hey, there's no need to write new laws. We have enough anti-protesting, rioting laws. You don't have to write any more new ones. Wasn't used. Surprisingly enough, wasn't used. And another kind of sick, twisted factoid about the H.Rap Brown Anti-Rioting Act of 1968 is it was put into the housing bill. So as many applaud the Great Society, the Johnson administration, the reformed Southern Dixiecrats, right? These new progressive Dixiecrats. There's a clip in the show of H.Rap Brown kind of calling that out in '68. It's pretty good. And we end the show, actually, of a clip of him under his new name, the man he is today, Jamil Al-Amin, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, talking about that terrorism is not inherently, pretty much was saying it's not inherently Muslim. It's a beautiful speech at the end of the show. So thank you guys for listening as I hear this music fade out. As I hear the beautiful Phoenix Joaquin in the background, it's my time to go. If you haven't done it already, like this, subscribe to this wherever you're listening to this. Share this with your people. Freedom for a political prisoner. Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H.Rap Brown, and I am out. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Saturday free show edition of This is Revolution Podcast. So before we get to today's topic, I would like everyone to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. As most of you know, we do read the comments. Also, if you have the means, support us on Patreon or check out our revolutionary merch. With Patreon, you get access to the After Hours show and, of course, our Discord server. And remember, when we get to 1,000 patrons, we will be doing a live show somewhere on the West Coast. I'm broadening it now to the West Coast because it may not even be in California. And with all that being said, let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles, my brother, my man.
And also, my other brother. Still in the East Coast, but he has went from the very vanilla Maine all the way to Chocolate City. He is Marcus of the Left Flank Vets.
Yeah. What's up? Blackiavelli. I'm back. I'm back from exile, close to power. Well, I'll right this ship in a few minutes, right? Just a few minutes. I'll right this ship.
And Pascal, since you put this show together, would you like to introduce our very special guest?
Oh no, I thought you were going to take that up, brother. I was not ready for such a charge. I was ready to come with the questions. Now you changing the roles. Oh man, brother. Oh, now you dropping change
up
the guard. Jason. Oh, it's like our guest today is the wonderful Sister Maha Elkollali, Esquire, member of the legal team of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H.Rap Brown, from the mid-'80s, and she is currently an attorney in South Florida, member of the Muslim community, also a teacher of law at Nova Southeastern Law School, here to discuss with us the case of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H.Rap Brown, and give us some background. Please welcome someone who I have profound respect for, who is definitely doing amazing things in the Muslim community of South Florida and overall, Sister Maha Elkollali.
Now, there was no way I was going to do an introduction that good. See? Pascal, that's why you had to do it. There was no way that I was going to do an introduction. So eloquent.
You caught me off guard, bro, which you rarely do.
Keep your brain on a swivel.
You could do it, Jason. I think you could have done it. Just keep it simple.
No. It had to be to this level because Pascal has been talking about this show actually for quite some time. So,
wow. Well, I appreciate you inviting me, Brother Pascal. So your last name is Robert, not Robert.
No, it's the French pronunciation being that, the Haitian thing.
Culturally unaware. My apologies.
It's okay. I thought it was more like Terrell Owens. Like he was like, no, it's Terrell, not Errol.
Sister Maha let you know that on Saturdays is what we call our free show because it goes as long as we want it to go because usually our shows are an hour. Then we have a patron section. Saturdays, our hosts and co-hosts get a little more relaxed. So if you see
free form,
if you see the brothers snapping on each other, making jokes, et cetera, so on and so forth, don't be surprised. Don't be dismayed. So it's a more chill, relaxed environment. Just let you know, so it's not formal. So you can, I know that you're going to be professional because that's the kind of person that you are. But you might see somebody, cut each other a look, go side eye someone, or just come out and start making your mama jokes. That
I shall roll with the punches.
Hey, feel free to tell if you have a good one.
Not a problem. I think that we can start easily. If you can, for our audience, Sister Maha, can you put Imam Jamil Al-Amin, as we all know him, but formerly H.Rap Brown, in historical context for us, going back to his days at SNCC and the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love this picture that you show. It's in the background, but anyways, I do love that picture. So Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly H.Rap Brown. It's interesting because I never realized that the majority of the American population never connected the fact that H.Rap Brown is Imam Jamil Al-Amin. And there was often this presumption that that H.Rap Brown either died or is incarcerated or, they didn't know anything about where he went. So it wasn't until recently that, this story is resurfacing and we're trying to bring it back to life that we connected the dots and realized people don't know. So H.Rap Brown, started his journey in his younger years. In 1964, he spent a lot of time at Howard University. His brother was attending Howard University. And at that time, there was a lot of political involvement through SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he got involved, and the idea of SNCC was to accelerate desegregation. So that's the beginning of the journey, not going into his childhood and his father's involvement in civil rights and mobilizing. But in the 1960s, so by 1967, he became the chairman of SNCC, following Stokely Carmichael. But Imam Jamil's historic civil rights activism is so intense. He met with President Lyndon Johnson. He was very active in moving or securing the Black vote and registering African Americans to vote in the 60s. He then in 1967 or 68, he ultimately became the Minister of Justice to the Black Panther Party as SNCC was starting to transition to that. So he was heavily involved. And in 1968, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, they were calling for control of education, calling for control of policing the Black community, calling for self-defense. And there was this huge movement to protect the oppressed, right? And a lot of, people view the Black Panther Party as this militant group, when in reality, it was a group that was designed to empower the Black community. They were feeding the children in the community. They were teaching laws. They were creating social service programs. I mean, they were doing grassroots efforts to empower the Black community. So that's kind of the underlying. Imam Jamil is, that civil rights icon that's still alive. So ultimately, the Black Panther Party, and at that time in the 60s, the government was starting to identify the rise of these potential Black male leaders and actually targeting them. So, as time goes on, right now, it's an interesting time because we have the COINTELPRO Full Disclosure Act that's been introduced. And I know I didn't discuss that with you all before, but it's on the table, was introduced to the House, I think back in May, where there's a call to disclose all the COINTELPRO documents. And within that discussion is Imam Jamil Al-Amin's case. So now with the release of, Judas and the Black Messiah, there's more of an awareness. And now there's a movie out, or it's kind of like a documentary, the FBI, it's MLK/FBI, which also discusses COINTELPRO. In both of those movies, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, H.Rap Brown, well, as far as, in the movies, he's shown as H.Rap Brown. He's in those because he was actually, H.Rap Brown was targeted as one of the potential men who would quote unquote rise as a Black messiah to empower the Black community. So I always forget the other names. Hold on, I have it here somewhere. Where J. Edgar Hoover, so COINTELPRO, just to let you know, was created August 1967. There's a memo. It's the counterintelligence program against Black nationalist hate groups. J. Edgar Hoover specifically called out H.Rap Brown, which is Imam Jamil Al-Amin, and 3 other men, including Stokely Carmichael, Elijah Muhammad, and Maxwell Stanford, as targets of the program. This is an extension of COINTELPRO. And most of the men that were on that list that were targeted by COINTELPRO have been assassinated. So the fact that Imam Jamil Al-Amin is alive, the fact that H.Rap Brown is alive is a miracle in and of itself. And we've done him an injustice to just forget him and to leave him serving a life sentence for a crime that he did not commit, for a crime that there is somebody else out there who consistently over 21 years has confessed to. So historically, not to get off your question, H.Rap Brown is a civil rights giant until 1971. He was incarcerated at Rikers in New York, and he converted to Islam. And that's where he started to transition from, the Black Power movement and the thought process of the Black Power movement to the human rights activist that he is today, that he was for the majority of his life. So this is a civil rights giant, an icon that led the people, that believed in humanity, that believed in justice, that wanted to empower the African American community. And then as he transitioned, as he grew, it grew into he was a servant of God for the betterment of all of humanity, all of the oppressed, irrespective of race, culture, background. If it was an injustice, it was his duty to speak out against it. And he did that zealously.
So thank you for that wonderful response. One of the things that I think is most important for me as someone whose mentors, my writing, particularly when it came to political education, were both members of the Black Panther Party, as a writer for Black Agenda Report, Bruce Dixon and Glenn Ford, was how their affiliation with the Black Panther Party gave them this kind of really sharp ability to do political analysis, particularly around the affairs of the Black American community relative to the ruling class, and other things as well. So it was amazing to see how that early education in the Black Panther Party really helped facilitate their understanding of the way in which America and capitalism was affecting the oppression of Blacks. And one of the things that I found valuable during the Obama presidency about Imam Jamil Al-Amin was a video. It's actually still on YouTube, as a matter of fact, of him being interviewed by Gil Noble of Like It Is. And Gil Noble asks him about, well, what if we get a Black president? And Imam Jamil, who was H.Rap Brown at the time, was like, a Black president will be of no better assistance to us than anything else, because the system is what decides the actions of the politician. And the system is based on the military industrial complex. And I was stunned that even at that time, before Obama was even in the consciousness of most people, that he was able to that level of sophisticated analysis that basically said that, a Black president would be simply be a tool of the same system that's consistently oppressing us. And for us to be somehow happy about that is ridiculous. So you addressed when Imam Jamil Al-Amin accepted Islam. Can you talk about the connection between Imam Jamil's worldview before Islam and the Islamic philosophy he developed afterwards, particularly in his discussed work, Revolution by the Book?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a part of this book, here's the book. I recommend everybody go get it. It's written by Imam Jamil Al-Amin. Well, while we're holding up books, let me show you the other one. This one, if anyone's interested, the imprisonment of Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, will give you an overview of like the case and how it's played out. But Revolution of the book talks about, well, let me rewind. Pascal, you mentioned about when members of the Black Panther Party, or people who were involved with the Black Panther Party, they developed this skill set and this, they're visionaries and they can dissect information and process. What happened with those people, including Imam Jamil Al-Amin, is that they learned what systemic reform looks like. They learned what it is to organize and the power of organizing people and how to move things to create change. They had a different viewpoint. So Imam Jamil Al-Amin essentially took those skills and brought it into, his becoming, H.Rap Brown took those skills and brought him into his transition of becoming Imam Jamil Al-Amin. And Revolution by the Book talks about, the spiritual component and creating this, revolutionizing yourself, right? And understanding and disciplining yourself. And if you revolutionize yourself and there's a spiritual component to your existence, then you can then revolutionize that which surrounds you. So he transitioned into saying that I understand the truth is not relative, that truth is universal. And it kind of, he just transitioned from Black power to, okay, I'm going to take what I learned to organize and systemic reform, and transitioned into human rights and applying it across the board. But this book basically highlights how he did that, and the importance of a spiritual component and revolutionizing yourself internally and making that a key component to the external revolution.
And you guys want to jump in with any question you might have for Sister Maha?
I guess I do. If you could expand on a little bit on the spiritual component. I know that the acceptance of Islam is was like a dividing line. And I guess can you expand on that as far as the spirituality? Is like something specific to Islam, or is this something that people with different faiths or no faith at all can find themselves finding as well?
I'm coming from a biased perspective, but Imam Jamil takes the 5 pillars of Islam into this revolution by the book. And he explains how applying those pillars will revolutionize yourself and how that applies in your everyday life. And if you stay focused, I mean, he's still extremely spiritually there and aware and active. And it's in his existence to be this person. So, for example, even now, if you speak to him, right, the first thing he will say, and everyone consistently says this when they meet him, he says, and he's in a federal prison, right? He'll say, is there anything I can do for you? He is this selfless human being. He is like the embodiment of his faith. So he takes the teachings of Islam and he applies them to his very existence. And in doing that, he becomes this leader that is exemplary to the world, where you want to do nothing but understand what he's saying and apply his knowledge, because he naturally, in his application of Islam, he naturally exhibits being humble. He naturally exhibits being a servant of a higher being a servant of God, and serving humanity and bettering humanity, because essentially that is the core of his faith. And it's something that you can't shake. You're talking about a man who was in solitary confinement for an extended period of time. He was literally under the ground for a long time with a window in the ceiling. And anyone knows, I mean, studies have been shown that, you know, after a short amount of time in solitary confinement, there are irreversible mental health.
It's torture. Solitary confinement is 100% torture.
And thank God this man has come out of that, and he still has his faculties. He is extremely sharp. At the age of 77, he is intellectually there. He is still a motivator and inspirer. He is everything he was when he went in. So in and of itself, I believe his spirituality and his understanding of Islam has allowed him the strength to continue with that.
And how many years total has he been in?
21. So I don't want to jump the gun because I know you all are going in order, but essentially, well, let me wait for the question.
Pascal has questions, and we're here to actually F up his order.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he will always
that's so,
and then ask you in order. So regardless of what we do.
Which,
right.
you know, since it is a Saturday show, and, you know, I'll say this, Pascal, we've had conversations, you know, about Islam, faith, you know, or as, you know, especially too, is like how faith can actually be a catalyst to leftist ideals and things of that nature. But it seems like what Maha is saying is that at least with Brown's, there was I don't know, more of like a mixing of who he is, who he was, and then, you know, an accentuation to that. But I guess like the thing that I wonder though is that, is there a, you know, specific religion, or is it, you know, something that people are supposed to pull out of spirituality and I think
it's just because we don't talk about this when we talk about natives who are defending water rights. They're defending something sacred. It's the defense of the sacred. So there's something to be said about spirituality when we talk about leftist movements. Like, what is it that gets into those priests that are in prison that are the anti-war protesters? You know what I mean? It's a defense of something sacred that's bigger than yourself.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. The only reason you would continue to fight when you're targeted, like he was targeted. You know, this man was targeted from the 1960s well into the 1990s and is now serving a life sentence of 21 years thereafter. He was hunted, and he relentlessly advocated for humanity. And the only reason anybody would subject themselves to that kind of I would say, torture over a long period of time is because he knows I'm answering to a higher being, and there is a bigger reason and a larger purpose to my existence. So kind of just to give you, it's easy for me to understand it because I read it, but just to give you an idea, in his book, he talks about the greatest form of oppression is the ignorance that exists within ourselves. So you have to dispel the ignorance that's within you to be able to fight the oppression of the ignorance and hatred that's outside of you. That's number one. And then he talks about the Congressional Prayer. So I don't know how many people on here are familiar with like how Muslims pray, but the Congressional Prayer is something that we hold, in high regard. We pray together. It's synchronized. We're in a line. It's very organized. There's a leader in the prayer, and there's no disruptions. It's very disciplined. So one thing he says is to dispel ignorance. Allah calls on us to be an organized force. And how do you learn to become an organized force? So the congregational prayer is how he describes it, is to synchronize the hearts of the believers. So if you pray together and you stand together and you call on God together, you're synchronizing your hearts as a force against something that is outside to dispel the hatred that's outside. And you're standing shoulder to shoulder, foot to foot, and you're making a prayer to one creator, irrespective of your race, irrespective of your culture, irrespective of your social background, your financial resources. You stand together. And that in and of itself, if you can unify people with this concept that we are all one under one creator and we are the same at the end of the day, then it makes it a lot easier to synchronize the hearts of the believers to fight the oppression that's outside. Just an example.
So, speaking in these terms, can you actually elaborate in terms of before the actual case came about? What was the activity of Imam Jamil Al-Amin within the Muslim community? What exactly were the kind of activities he was in? I'm familiar with his role in terms of in Atlanta and how high he rose in terms of the leadership of that area. Can you elaborate a bit on that for our audience who may not be aware that not only was he a leader in the Black Power movement, but he was actually as much of a leader as well in the Muslim community?
Yeah, so what's interesting about him is his gift of bridging communities. This is a man who can speak to, he can speak to President Lyndon Johnson, and then he can speak to, the person on the street who's struggling with a drug habit. And he can empower people and give information to both spectrums. So he was a bridge, So in 1971, he took his Shahada at Rikers. I believe he was released around 1973. So long story short, he did create the Muslim community on the west end of Atlanta. And that community was, there were a lot of drugs, there was violence. He was able to actually create a peace treaty between the different gangs that were there to try to make that community safer for all of its residents. He cleaned up the drugs in that area. He made it a safe haven. And everything in that community revolved around the 5 prayers in that masjid. So the basketball courts are right there. I don't know how many of you have been to the West End, and everything would stop and everybody would run to prayer. And, there are people who grew up on the West End who speak about this, who are definitely, better at discussing the details of that than me, but he empowered an entire community and he changed how that community functions. So not just doing that, but he was also able to communicate with the immigrant Muslim community, and he created the foundation of the national organizations now in the Muslim community, including ISNA, ICNA, MAS. So he was one of our main leaders in the Muslim community. And the fact that he was taken and the fact that there's so much evidence to show that there's no way that this case was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And the only way that they got this conviction was through some serious constitutional violations on the trial level. It's appalling that we are this silent at advocating for his release and advocating for his exoneration and clearing his name. But unfortunately, when you're on the federal radar, advocating for him makes you a target. And a lot of people just aren't willing to become a target or take that risk of becoming a target. And, fear actually influences silence. And that's kind of what we have. So you have a giant, not just in the civil rights movement, not just in the human rights movement. This is a man who laid the foundation for the national Muslim organizations in the United States.
And before we get to the next question, it's just something that you'd laid out that I think is extremely important, especially when we're talking about some of these movements being, commodified. There's a lot of people who even, on the left that will puff up, either like Black Panthers and certain things. But what is communal safety, and it's not just strapping guns and to your chest and saying like, hey, we're tough. No, it's bridging gaps between gangs, right? And saying like, hey, just chill out on crime, and that, which is like dangerous. It can be extremely dangerous. But at the end of the day, it's actually like healing communities. And while, I yell ACAB, defund the police, all those things, at the end of the day, saving a community doesn't have too much to deal with the police and actually has to deal with the community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can go into that, dive in as far as, drugs being pumped into the Black community. That's a whole other conversation. But Imam Jamil understood, the systemic oppression of Black people. And he understood that sometimes, what appears to be on the surface, like you'll hear a lot about, Black on Black crime, but you don't see the underlying cause of what's happening and where these drugs are coming from in the Black community and who's really running this show. So to create peace among Black people and to create peace among these gang members and to create this respect for human life and dignity and to have them respect him as a spiritual leader who actually cares. He's like a paternal figure. He's very loving. He will stop and make you think you are the most important person to him and listen to what you need and what your struggle is. So he can literally empower anyone, so.
And I'll say, one last thing that was like, it's important too, is like guns, where the guns come from. That's another thing. Not, because there's a lot of crime in Chicago with guns bought and sold in Indiana, a lot of like big white areas with lax gun laws and all that type of shit. But
so moving on to the next question, Sister Maha, can you share the facts of Imam Jamil Al-Amin's case that led particularly to his incarceration? So let's move to the crux of the matter in terms of how this great leader, this historical movement activist, this organizer gets basically put behind bars.
Yeah, this story is kind of crazy as it unfolds even more and more. And like with the FOIA requests and seeing documents, it's like shocking to the conscience, right? I'm losing my voice. But
quick side question. Do you ever work with, we had Fred Hampton's lawyers on the show before. Do you ever go back and have to talk with the cats that covered some of these older cases to see, or is that doesn't really help you in what you're doing at this point?
No, it does. Sometimes I'll exchange notes to get an understanding. I won't say which cases, but yeah, sometimes we do exchange notes, or I'll see someone and I'll grab them to the side and I'll be like, hey, I found this. Does that ring to you? And there's a lot of parallels in these cases. So yeah, I mean, informally we exchange notes, or if I feel like something worked, we may look at that and say, okay, well, they did this, maybe we should try that. So it's more like brainstorming. So just to be really clear on my role, I'm actually not even a criminal defense attorney. I practice in family. And the way I got into this case was in the 90s, Imam Jamil Al-Amin was a leader who I respected immensely. And going through law school, I remember just asking, where is he? What happened to him? What is the update? And it was just this constant generic answer of, he has a legal team, they're taking care of it, he's fine. And it wasn't until, I want to say last year, it's been a little over a year. And I watched Kyrie El-Amin, his son, who's also an attorney. He did a podcast similar to this, and they had outlined through Students for Imam Jamil, which everyone should follow on IG. It's _student free Imam Jamil, _free Imam Jamil. And they had outlined this link tree where there were action items, and you click on it and you could send letters asking for his transfer, asking for his exoneration, asking them to reopen the case. They made it so easy. And that's when I realized, I was like, wow, this case went silent. So I reached out to Kyrie and I spoke to Imam Jamil's wife, Karima. And I was like, listen, I'm not a criminal attorney, but this is our leader, and whatever I can do, I'd want to be of service to you. And at that time, he was being blinded intentionally, which I'll get into. And I was like, wait a minute, so what attorneys are on this? And I realized like our community really didn't have any attorneys on this. And it was appalling to me. It was just shocking to the conscience. So I reached out to every civil rights organization in our community, and I'm like, we need to do something. Like, I'm not going to argue with you on what the evidence is, but we need to make sure he doesn't go blind. And that's kind of how I got involved. So I was pulling the pieces together, if you will, because even in doing this, the short time that I've been doing it, like, I cannot believe his family has had to ride this storm alone. It is exhausting and draining and overwhelming. So it's more of I am not attorney of record, but I like facilitate calls, conference calls, and kind of pull the pieces together to see, okay, we have this legal issue. Who's going to take it? Who's available to take it? Because believe it or not, a lot of attorneys are just petrified to touch this case. So that's kind of my involvement. But Pascal, rewinding to your question, so this all started, Imam Jamil had a traffic stop, and it was a traffic violation, and there was a court hearing set for this traffic violation. And it's crazy because there was a snowstorm, the hearing was reset, he didn't show up to court on this traffic violation. And when he didn't show up for court on the traffic violation, they issued a warrant for his arrest, which is insane. And they were serving the warrant the night before, you know, one of our two holiest annual holidays, before the Eid. And they were serving the warrant on him at his store. So at that time, my understanding, I wasn't there obviously, but my understanding, pulling pieces together, he was making Isha prayer at the mosque that he leads, which is not far from his store. And simultaneously, Otis Jackson, who we now know has confessed to this crime repeatedly, was at the store also looking for Imam Jamil. Otis Jackson was on parole, had an ankle monitor that was dysfunctional that day. And as he rolls up looking for Imam Jamil, so do these two officers who want to issue this warrant for Imam Jamil's arrest because he didn't show up to traffic court, right? So Otis panics. Long story short, they get into this battle, this gun. There's an exchange of you know, fire. There were firearms and shooting on both ends. Two officers were shot. One officer ultimately died, and the other officer lived but was injured. And they give the description of the assailant as being 5'8" with gray eyes. Okay, so Imam Jamil finishes praying, he's leaving, he sees there's an exchange of fire, he keeps going, obviously, because he's like, okay, maybe there's gang violence or something in the area, and he keeps it moving. Long story short, they give this description, they say both officers said that they shot the assailant, and on the news, based on several accounts and on the news, there were witnesses that said he was shot, that Otis was shot, and there was trails of blood all over the street, and that he was running up the street trying to catch a ride. Okay, so Imam Jamil sees now they're targeting him, and they're saying that he shot two officers, that this former Black Panther shot two officers, and he flees. And Otis is shot. He ends up getting picked up, violated for his parole, right? And Imam Jamil heads to Alabama. And he knows now there's a full hunt for him. But the description still, the original description is 5'8", gray eyes. Imam Jamil Al-Amin is 6'5". He is extremely tall, and he has brown eyes. And he always wears glasses. So I'm not really sure how you would see his eye color, but nonetheless, he goes to Alabama, and there are several holes in this case, right? So the first one is that description I told you about. It doesn't match him. The second part is that the assailant was shot based on what the officers said. Imam Jamil Al-Amin was not shot. When they retrieved him in Alabama, he was not shot. He had no gunshot wounds. He had no blood on him. He had no gun residue on him. There is nothing, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence putting him at the scene. They tested the blood, and they said, because they were so sure it was Imam Jamil Al-Amin's blood, it comes back inconclusive. They never test the blood against Otis Jackson. Okay, so, and then they go to Alabama, they retrieve his vehicle, they drive the vehicle from Alabama all the way back to Georgia. And then miraculously, there was the bullet case remained on the windshield, allegedly, from Alabama to Georgia. And the ballistics match that bullet case to Imam Jamil. I don't know how that's possible, but nonetheless, the ballistics expert, Bernadette Davy, was ultimately, after this case, fired. And she was the key witness as far as the forensics and the ballistics on this case. She was fired for faulty ballistics, and it's been found on several cases thereafter that she engaged in this faulty ballistics over and over and over again. So there are so many holes in this case. Now, this is a state. This is a state of Georgia conviction through Fulton County. So it's a state conviction, and he's being held by the federal government. And so it's kind of interesting because the FBI suddenly gets wind of this. And there's an agent, and he tells them, I want to ride from Georgia to Alabama to retrieve Imam Jamil. So he rides, and he says he's going to ride alone. He doesn't ride with the rest of the team. And he goes, and ironically, he's also the one who found the weapons. So after the trial and through the FOIA request, there was a document discovered by an officer. And of course, none of this came before the jury at the trial. That it was based on how the weapons were found. It appears that they were placed, not that they were found. They were placed there. And these are all things that never came before the jury, that were never heard. So the FBI agent ultimately is the one who found the weapons. And this FBI agent had a prior of killing another Black man by shooting him in the back and planting fingerprintless guns on that person. And again, these are fingerprintless guns that were retrieved in Alabama. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on about the whole in this case.
And I'll say too, like I think one of the more ridiculous things that I'd seen, and just like kind of like looking in, kind of preparing for the show, is like this guy is on video in front of a judge for another crime, saying, "Yes, I killed this guy," and Al-Amin is serving a prison sentence for it. Like literally in a U.S. court saying, "Yes, I did that murder," and someone else is serving the time. Yeah.
So Otis Jackson, he from the very beginning, from the time of the arrest, had given anybody who can listen, he has given a confession over and over in writing under sworn written documents. And in this particular one, it was, I think, 2020, it was a separate trial. Otis does go back on the record and he says, yeah. And it's interesting. I don't know if you could play that clip, but they portray Otis as this crazy guy who is incompetent to stand trial, who doesn't know what he's talking about. Otis comes across as so intelligent and so precise in his detail when he testifies to this in that trial. The prosecutor had to take a break afterwards because he didn't know where to go with it. I mean, Otis Jackson has the bullet wounds from the date of the shooting. He was injured in that crossfire. Otis Jackson has said the clothes were in my closet. Otis Jackson was violated on his parole shortly thereafter, and his ankle monitor was not functional. Like, not only is he confessing in writing and giving sworn statements in writing and swearing and attesting to it in a trial, there is corroborating physical evidence that shows that this man did this. So it's appalling. It's appalling. This case should shock the conscience of any human being who has any belief in our judicial system. I mean, even the 11th Circuit addresses the prosecutor. Hold on, I got to get to it. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeal states, "We regret that we cannot provide Mr. Al-Amin relief in the face of prosecutorial misconduct that occurred at his trial. A prosecutor's duty in a criminal proceeding is not to secure conviction by any means, but to ensure that justice will prevail. The prosecutor at Al-Amin's trial failed to live up to that duty. The district court," and then fast forwarding, the district court also failed to consider the most direct evidence of substantial and injurious effect or influence on the verdict. A juror's affidavit admitted in the state habeas proceedings attesting that Mr. Al-Amin's failure to testify, the entire point of the prosecution's mock cross-examination constituted the main thing that led the jury to convict him. So this was another, it's like constitutional violation after violation. So rewinding to the initial warrant, that initial traffic violation was thrown out, and it was found to be a violation of his Fourth Amendment right to be free from search and seizure. So the whole thing that started this was thrown out and found to be a violation of his Fourth Amendment right, okay? So fast forward to the trial, and you know, I'm not gonna talk about all the violations, but this particular one in the closing argument, you know, every criminal defendant has the right not to testify. And in fact, most of them will not testify at trial. It is so egregious and disgusting for a prosecutor to do a mock cross-examination in a closing argument. And, you know, I did look on the record, and the defense attorneys did object, repeatedly objected, but that is naturally going to influence the jury. It's terrible. So, I mean, it's unfortunate what has happened, but what's more unfortunate is our silence on the matter. The fact that we have a historic figure, somebody that was key in America's civil rights movement, that was involved in SNCC, that was involved in the Black Panther Party, that was involved with human rights activism, that advocated against the Bosnian genocide, that advocated for the empowerment of the Palestinian people. This man crossed all lines and advocated for the well-being of humanity. Our silence is deafening. It's deafening.
This is stunning. I mean, this is really incredible that, you know, the degree of prosecutorial, I mean, you literally have the 11th Circuit Appellate Court admitting that there was pervasive prosecutorial misconduct on the lower court's behalf, and yet in the same statement saying, sorry, we can't vacate that judgment. And in the same statement, by the way, admitting that the basis of the conviction was something that goes on normally in criminal cases throughout the country, that the defendant chose not to testify. I don't know of any attorney worth his weight in anything that would advise a client to testify in the criminal proceeding.
And I think the other, like, I'm not a lawyer, right? Like the bottom half of the screen, right? Oh, okay. This side of the screen right now, not lawyers. That side, lawyers. But from my understanding, right, is like the admissible evidence, right? There has to be a legal process, and as far as like how evidence is, put into the whole system. If you don't get the evidence the right way, you can't use it, right? Like that's a thing. And so if him getting wrapped up in all this isn't legal in the first place, like, don't they have to wind it all back?
Yeah, you should. I mean, this is shocking to the conscience. Let me tell you, the fact that you have a confession and you haven't fully investigated that confession is appalling. Right? This is not theoretically what our judicial system is supposed to do. There needs to be, the Innocence Project. I see somebody talking about that. The problem with the Innocence Project is it's only DNA. It has to be blood samples. So there has been some talk about the blood that was on the street. Unfortunately, there's a 21-year-old case. And even asking for the ballistics, it's like, oh, well, we have to locate the evidence. I'm like, locate the evidence
or somewhere.
Exactly. And like the thing is,
like your highest profile case in Fulton County. I'm just, of course you have to locate the evidence.
Well, I mean, the cops do almost everything terribly, but I mean, I'm sure that they hold on to things, diligently, just like a library.
Well, I found the clip of Otis Jackson confessing.
Yeah, I should have told you where that was. If you go to
admitting, too late now.
No, but I want to tell everybody else. You can go to, and I don't know how to comment on this thing, so I don't know.
I'll put the link up. I found it on our YouTube.
But if you go to what happened to the #2rap.com, there is a rundown of this case. There are several videos giving you updates. I mean, I'm giving you kind of the fastest rundown I can. But if you're interested in the details of it, you go to what happened, the #2rap. and this video is there along with others. Or if you want to know the action items, go to freeimamjamil.com and you'll get the link to the action items.
So check this out, ladies and gentlemen.
No, sir, I was not.
In fact, another person was tried and convicted.
There's an echo.
Al-Amin, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And once again, it seems to me like you are getting a lot of
I was shot that day.
I'm sorry?
I was shot March of 2000. It happened March 17th of 2000.
Your Honor, we can take a break right now. Come back.
Okay. All right, we'll take a 10 minutes.
After that, I'd probably need a break too, because that was information that was never supposed to make it into the record. As you can see, they try to discredit him at every turn, but it's not possible. He was there. He was out of prison. He was living in Atlanta. And most importantly, he was wounded in the commission of this crime. So now we have a man who has confessed to the crime, who fits the description of the crime, who was in the area during the commission of the crime, who was shot during the commission of the crime. What more do we need, at least, to look at the case again? He didn't testify in the first case. If you think he's crazy, put him on the stand. Prove it. But this is the man who committed the murder that my father served 20 years for. This is the man who was also willing and able to take responsibility for that still to this day. So if nothing else, we deserve a new trial just based on this. But as you've seen, we have plenty of reasons for it. So if you were on the fence, please sign the petition. Please share the petition. We have to let the Conviction Integrity Unit, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and Mr. Paul Howard know that we're paying attention and we demand fairness and justice in this matter. As always, it's Free Imam Jamil, and I'm going to leave you with a reading of an article about the confessions, which will give you some more detailed insight into what he's been saying for the last 20 years. This man deserves to be heard. He just doesn't want the imam to be taking the fall for a murder that he committed. It's that simple. Otis Jackson is a self-proclaimed leader of the almighty Vice Lords Nation. Founded in the late 1950s, the AVLN is one of the oldest street gangs in Chicago. According to Jackson, the group under his leadership was focused on rebuilding communities by pushing out drug dealers and violence. In a never-before-published sworn deposition, Jackson recalls the events of the night of Thursday, March 16, 2000 in vivid detail. It was a cool night, as Jackson remembers. He wore a knee-high black Islamic thobe with black pants, a black kufi, Muslim head covering, underneath a tan hat, and a tan leather jacket. His silver sunglasses with yellow tint sat above his full beard and mustache. He arrived at Mix around 7 p.m. when he realized his schedule had changed. He was no longer the food expediter in the kitchen. His title was now dishwasher cook, which meant he would wash dishes and then help close the kitchen at night. Since his title changed, he wasn't required to work that Thursday night. It immediately dawned on him that he had a 10-hour window to do whatever he wanted. As a parolee under house arrest, the opportunity to have truly free time was rare if it ever even existed. Jackson decided to fill his newfound freedom like most people fill their free time. He ran a few errands. His first stop was the West End Mall, where he got a bite to eat, did some shopping, and then headed toward the West End Community Mosque, led by Al-Amin. He knew it was a regular building off of Oak Street, but wasn't sure which one exactly. He parked his black Cadillac in an open field and walked down toward a house that turned out to be the mosque. He passed the black Mercedes before he got to the mosque, where he met a man named Lamar Mustafa Tanner. They talked for a while, during which Jackson explained to Tanner that he was looking for Al-Amin to talk about how the AVLN could help Al-Amin's community. Tanner told Jackson to check the grocery store, since Al-Amin could usually be found there. Tanner then gave Jackson his phone number and hurried away to go pick up his wife. Jackson proceeded to the grocery store. He wanted to discuss with Al-Amin how his AVLN group could help further clean the streets of drug dealers in the West End community. By the time Jackson made his way to Al-Amin's store, it was already late. He was afraid the store would be closed since he didn't see anyone else on the street. His fear was affirmed. The store wasn't open. Hoping that maybe the owner would be in the back closing up, he knocked on the door a few more times. No answer. As he turned to leave, Jackson saw a patrol car pull up. By the time Jackson walked by the black Mercedes, the patrol car was parked in front of it, nose to nose. The driver of the patrol car got out and asked Jackson to put his hands up. Immediately, the scenario flashed through Jackson's head. Here he was, violating his parole by not being at work with a 9mm handgun in his waist. Jackson was afraid the cops would think he was breaking into the store. That meant they would probably frisk him and find the gun. The gun would be a direct violation of his parole, and he'd be sent back to prison in Nevada. Jackson ignored the order to put his hands up and instead began to explain that he was not trying to break into the store. He stated that he wasn't trying to steal the Mercedes either. His car was parked down the street. Both officers were out of the car with guns drawn and demanding Jackson put his hands up. The cops were closing in, and there was little space between them. Jackson made a quick decision. He backed up against the Mercedes, pulled out his gun, and began to fire. He fired off 2 shots. The officers, while retreating, returned fire. Jackson wasn't hit and bolted toward his car, where in the trunk he had an arsenal of other weapons. As Jackson explained, the organization I was about to form, the Almighty Vice Lord Nation, were anti-oppression, and we fight, drug dealers and whatnot, so we need artillery. He quickly opened the trunk. The lock was broken and held together with shoestring, and grabbed a lightweight semi-automatic carbine Ruger Mini 14 with an extended clip housing 40 .223 caliber rounds. Jackson then headed back toward the cops. One was moving for cover behind the Mercedes, the other on the police radio screaming for backup. Jackson approached the officer he thought was the most aggressive, who was using the Mercedes for cover, and resumed firing his rifle. The officer returned fire, hitting Jackson in the upper left arm twice. Jackson, now angered and fearful for his life, shot back, downing the officer. Jackson stood over him and shot him in the groin up to 4 times. The fallen officer, Deputy Kinchin, in a last attempt to plead with his killer, described his family, mother, and children to Jackson, hoping for mercy. But Jackson admits that by this time, my mind was gone, so I really wasn't paying attention. Jackson fired again at the officer on the ground, dripping his own blood on the concrete where he stood.
It's getting a little graphic there for a Saturday morning.
Not the most cheery.
It's like,
No,
you kept it all the way real. But I mean, it's your dad is in prison, so I'm sure you want every detail out there.
Yeah, and Kyrie does a good job at outlining the case and giving the details so that there's no question about what has happened. I mean, and when you hear the details of the crime, we sympathize with the families of those officers. It's terrible what happened to them. But the bottom line is, you got to bring justice by prosecuting the correct person. You don't use this injustice and this disgusting act to then justify prosecuting a human rights activist because he was a target of COINTELPRO. It's like adding insult to injury.
And I wonder, though, like some of the things that you're kind of laying out, though, is like there's layers to the injustice, I guess. Because, I mean, like 6'5" black dude, right? Like, come on, right? Whether you're organizing or you're just trying to shoot some hoops, like you're menacing. And then you start getting into some of these other things that would like explain like why someone would be, targeted by the justice system, and you get COINTELPRO and all these things. And I guess, like you said, that none of that's that surprising, right? I think anyone that's watching, that's, been This Is a Revolution viewer, which we all appreciate you, like, subscribe, hit the bell, right? You're not going to be surprised by any of this that you're hearing. But like you said, kind of like what's sad is that this type of information has been more widely shared, and there isn't, I guess a cohesive movement on the left to kind of keep the pressure on to get him free. So,
and another, here's a question, and maybe this is a dumbass question or thought. There was a movie that came out 20 years ago. Do you remember when the DA prosecuted the killer of was it Medgar Evers, like 20, 30 years after the fact? I mean, 30 years after. Do you remember that, Pascal?
I think I vaguely remember what you're talking about.
And it became kind of a political thing to like right the wrongs of the South, right? Does this happen in these cases of, because we've had people on this show that were in prison for 40 years that were former Panthers. A lot of the people that were involved with COINTELPRO, higher ups, we're not talking about boots on the ground agents, are dead. So at this point, does the U.S. government like to free some people as some sort of olive branch of, see, it's all better now? Because also the people they're freeing are in their 70s, and it's a very different world.
Okay, so this brings us to where we are, right? There are people who want to correct the wrong, and there are people who carry the torch. I kind of call it COINTELPRO too. And you would think it's common sense, right? Oh, that was the 60s. Let's make this right. But it's not. It's not. It's alive and well right now. Okay, let me give a little touch of hope, right? So where the case is right now, it's twofold. It was threefold, but I'll start with the Conviction Integrity Unit. So yes, Fulton County District Attorney has a newly created Conviction Integrity Unit, right? And hold on, I have their statement here somewhere. So essentially their purpose is that the Conviction Integrity Unit will conduct collaborative good faith case reviews designed to ensure the integrity of a conviction and remedy wrongful convictions, as well as establish policies and procedures to learn from the errors identified so the criminal justice system is strengthened. So this is newly formed, and the DA in Fulton County has changed, and DA Willis has agreed to reopen the case. It has been reopened under the Conviction Integrity Unit. So this is like our ray of light, right? And I know that they are looking at this case intensely. And without revealing all the details, it's an active case. It is an active case under the Conviction Integrity Unit. And what the Conviction Integrity Unit can do, they have three options. Either they can reduce the sentencing and issue time served and release him, or they can recommend a new trial, or they can exonerate him and recommend release, which is obviously what we would want. This is a man who's 77 years old. He is extremely medically fragile. He's still there and coherent. His intellect is intact. His mental health is intact, but he's medically fragile. So the obstacle with this is that they need to be able to access him. And he is across the country in Arizona in a, federal prison, and it's quite the mission to get to him. This case was reopened during COVID, so people weren't traveling. And, there's one of those action items on freeimamjamil.com is requesting for his transfer back to Georgia. So that's kind of our next step. What I'm learning is like baby steps, finish one thing, get to the next, and little tiny steps. So what we need is for the Conviction Integrity Unit to have access to him, and for the Conviction Integrity Unit to have access to Otis Jackson. So this is, it is, the ball is moving, and that is going. The other part of this is there was a case in 2020, State v. Lane, where the Georgia Supreme Court changed a ruling, basically, and said that this particular case needed to be reassessed based on cumulative prejudice on the trial level. And that's the appellate brief has been filed, but it's kind of on hold, waiting for what the Conviction Integrity Unit will do. So there are avenues. This is a very, very active case. Like, we want everyone to know, it's not like he's sitting in a prison and there's no hope. There is hope, but what we need is outside pressure. And then, of course, the way I got on this case was his medical condition, that he had cataract, and he was blinded in one eye when I got on this case. And so we ended up it was just calling different attorneys, calling legal meetings, trying to figure out who's going to file this habeas in federal court to force the federal prison to give basic medical treatment. By the time that complaint was filed with the federal court, he was blind in both eyes. And they actually left him blind in both eyes for an extended period of time. And this is like intentional. This is malicious. This is a violation of his 8th Amendment to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. But what was more appalling is going through his medical records and having my expert look at it. And it's interesting because it was a Jewish doctor looking at it, right? And he was just like, I am disgusted with what they did to him. So in 2017, he was high risk for glaucoma. And if you leave that untreated and unattended to, it's permanent blindness. It's irreversible. So they didn't even bother to test him from 2017. From 2018 until 2021, they allowed the cataracts to develop. Every doctor said he needed immediate cataract surgery, and they ignored it. And these are the little malicious, intentional, disgusting things that they do to harm him. He was previously in Colorado, and like I said, it was the Supermax facility underground, and they were basically executing him through medical neglect. And at that time, there was an outcry, and he was transported from the Supermax to this level 3 federal prison in Arizona, in Tucson. And he was really supposed to be in a level 4 federal prison to address his extensive medical needs. So he is medically neglected. There are intentional things that happen to him that it's just brutal. It's like, it's inhumane. It's disgusting. It's shocking to the conscience, but it happens. Or for example, his transport from Colorado to Arizona, he was in the back of a very hot vehicle. He's shackled at the arms, at the feet, at the waist. This is an elderly man, okay? He's medically fragile, and they leave him in the back of this hot truck until he finally collapses and requires to be hospitalized on emergency care.
Is it just one of those?
Yeah, because he almost died. It's like, oh, oops, we almost.
Is it just because, okay, look, you're like one of the last of the big name activists of this era, and once you're gone, then everyone will forget the rest that are still locked up. Does it feel like that?
It's interesting because Imam Jamil, as a human being, he has this voice, right? It's like this calm, inspiring voice. And it's weird because when he speaks, people actually will listen. Like, he can move people very quickly. So, during the trial, there was an official gag order. After the trial, remember, this is a historic figure. You can imagine how many people want to document his life, how many people want to include, his recollection of the civil rights movement, his recollection of the 60s and desegregation of this country. They have consistently declined to allow historians, the media, across whoever wants to talk to him, it's denied as a matter of national security. And they don't allow people to talk to him. It wasn't until recently, I don't want to kill this guy's name, but he's writing a book, and he kept getting denied his visitation request, kept getting denied. And he ultimately said, you know what? He found someone, because a lot of attorneys declined to take his case. He found someone who would, draft the pleadings, and he told the federal government, you either give me access to him or I'm going to file this lawsuit. And you answer to the federal courts. And finally, they agreed to negotiate the terms of him having these sessions with him for a preliminary documentation of his version of this history. So they have over 21 years gagged him and made sure that his story is not out. Because once he tells the story, you're convinced it's a wrap. This is a man who is extremely intelligent. He is a man of humanity. He will move you. You will be convinced. So even, he ended up, we did a podcast like this, and Kyrie was on it, and there was, legal calls are scheduled. And I was like, Kyrie, don't miss the call. He got off. He was talking to Imam Jamil, and Imam Jamil happened to make, just give us a few words on that podcast. And that thing went viral, and everyone was like, they remembered, oh, he's alive, just from the sound of his voice on a 2-minute clip. So I don't know if you all want to play that, but it shows just how moving he is. Here, I can, you know what, Pascal, I think I sent you the clip of that if you all want to play it. It's really short.
Me in the chat. I found some, if people want to get some, this is some vintage footage here in the Bay Area where I live of H.Rap and Stokely Carmichael in the town in 1968.
See, unlike America would have us believe, the greatest problem confronting this country today is not pollution and bad breath. It's black people. It's black people. See, that's just one of the big lies that America tells you and that you go for because you chumps. You go for it. One of the lies that we tell ourselves is that we are making progress. But here his chair is empty. We're not making progress. We tend to equate progress with concessions. We can no longer make that mistake. You see, when they gave us that nigger astronaut, you say we were making progress, but I told you they were going to lose him in space. He didn't get that far.
Damn.
You put Adam Powell in office and you couldn't keep him. What you think they're going to do with Thurgood Marshall when they get tired of him? They gave you Walter Washington of Washington, D.C., and you said we were making progress. That's not progress. See, it's no in-between. You're either free or you're a slave. There's no such thing as second-class citizenship. But a lot of you running around talking about you Democrats, and the Democrats got you in the biggest trick going. They tell you it ain't our fault, it's the Dixiecrats. There's no such thing as a Dixiecrat. The only difference between George Wallace and Lyndon Johnson is one of them's wife got cancer.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. God dang it.
You know, so what I find interesting about that quote, and I would love to get your guys' opinion on this.
I love it.
Is when that act passes through the Johnson administration, and you know who else would be fun to talk about this with is Cedric Johnson, Pascal. As those Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Rights Act passed through the Great Society legislation of the Johnson administration, it really changes the way we look at Democrats, and in some people's eyes gives you the rise of Southern Democratic leaders like Jimmy Carter and later Bill Clinton. I don't know, Margaret Kimberly probably would know better than I would. I don't know if we had a Southern Democratic president. Was Carter the first?
In the post-civil rights era, definitely.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, are you talking about before the Democratic Party flipped over and became the quote-unquote party of civil rights? Post-FDR, that probably would have been the first one, would have been Carter, yeah.
So those programs, that legislation did a lot to his point about, hey, these Dixiecrats and Democrats, there really is no difference. These are the same people.
Well, that, I mean, like, yeah, it's like that's where too, it's like you see, even with like New Deal policies, you know, like that's where redlining comes from, is that like there was housing for some, but not all. And like, oh, hey, how do you have to divvy up these neighborhoods and make sure one type of people stay here and everybody else? That is,
that's from FDR, who's a 1%er from the North, a Yankee, if you will. We're talking about, you know, Lyndon Johnson. Was he from Texas?
Yep.
Racism is viewed as a very Southern thing. We have to remember that. Definitely Martin Luther King talks about going to Chicago and how horrible that was. And you have the neo-Nazi march when he was there in 64, 65, whatever. But we view racism collectively, not the people on this show, collectively, right, through this lens of water hoses, dogs, Bull Connor, Selma, even though it was in the North.
Yeah, which there's something like interesting is that like some of like Jim Crow actually like laws come like straight out of Philadelphia, but then also too of like in this like collective memory, you know, as like the South is racist, it's also like the area with the most black people in it.
Yeah,
and so like, how do you know? How do we actually square this?
Well, I think that those tales of northern quote unquote progressive indulgence on the issues of race are something that is projected by, you know, the intellectual elite in the left flank of capital. It's definitely not something any black people who live in the Northeast, like myself, who grew up in New York City, which was a profoundly racist town, even in the 80s and 90s, would even think about. I mean, I don't even have to talk about you, Jason, growing up in the Bay Area, right in the shadow of San Francisco. And, you know, Marcus coming from Ohio, which Ohio in and of itself, I mean, good grief, the history of racial antagonism there is there. So this mythology of like liberal states in the Northeast or in the North being progressive on race. I went to law school in Boston. Don't get me started about.
Yeah, I was about to say Boston. Raytheon Acres, Boston. Yeah, come on.
So I mean, it's
so I don't know. That's why I found that statement so illuminating in 1968 to say that.
This definitely that's definitely a misnomer. I don't think anyone who lives in the Northeast in those cities would even think about the fact that calling those quote unquote liberal Democratic Party bastions like Chicago, like non-racist. Come on, man.
It's very. I would love to be able to hear his take now, 53 years later. I would love to hear his critique of the Democratic Party, of a even more rightward shift of a Democrat Party, how he views the neoliberal shift of these Southern Dixiecrats that became not just Democrats but presidents. So I don't know. That's why I think it's important to these people.
I can guess, but I won't.
Well, I do want to ask, like, on the political tip, Maha, you'd mentioned a bill earlier, and I was wondering if you could kind of go a little bit more into that.
Yeah, the COINTELPRO Full Disclosure Act was actually introduced by Bobby Rush, who was also formerly part of the Black Panther Party, or involved in the Black Panther Party. So it's introduced. It hasn't really moved. So, but essentially what it is that it's requesting full disclosure. And there's fear that this disclosure will compromise the informants, because that's always shocking to the conscience who those people are. So there's, the idea that they can redact who the informants are to try to, it's on the table to disclose those documents and to create a library of the COINTELPRO documents. Obviously, those documents involve everybody from Dr. King to Malcolm X to Imam Jamil, to several of members of Congress, Fred Hampton. I mean, those documents are extensive and would take a long time to go through. Just to kind of give you an idea, the FOIA request for Imam Jamil Al-Amin was 44,000 pages of documents. This was like heavy surveillance. And these documents are released, not in any good order, and you got to fill it and find the relevant documents. But you're talking about heavy surveillance that led to the assassination of some very important people. And then within that, obviously, is to reassess the current political prisoners that are being held as an extension of, the efforts through COINTELPRO. So there is no question that COINTELPRO's methods of surveillance were unconstitutional. Like, that is open and on the table. Everybody knows it. The question is, are they really going to move forward and do what's right to release that information or not?
Yeah, and I do like wonder, and like I guess this is like toss up to the panel, because I think there's a connection there between like state surveillance and just honestly with the United States of a legacy going back to COINTELPRO all the way to now, where like you know obviously because of 9/11, you know, the security state, you know, took that as a reason to, you know, surveil like literally everyone. So it's not even just hey, you know, there's these charismatic black dudes out there that are starting to, you know, really gain some traction, versus like literally now we have the right to take in any data for anyone. I mean, do you see any, I guess, like deep ties to that, or that's kind of just basic, you know, state surveillance type things?
You know, what makes this case so interesting is that if you chip away at constitutional rights, you know, for any human being, you're chipping away at those constitutional rights and you're setting a precedent that's very dangerous for the rest of humanity in this country. Like, just to compromise to the extent that they did in COINTELPRO opens a dangerous door. You're putting informants in places and you're digging up dirt and turning people against each other and basically staging assassinations. It's just, that's not what we're allegedly about, right? You know, that's allegedly what the Constitution doesn't want you to do. But behind hidden doors, there's a different method of doing this. So it can't be both. You either do this the right way, you know, you can't do it the right way in front of the public, and then your hidden agenda is that you do it using no rules. Like, there are rules to this thing. So it's just scary because at this point, it's not even chipping away at constitutional rights. It's like, where are they? Do they even exist? You know, or is this just like something that we tell people because it sounds so beautiful? You know?
Yeah, which I think, you know, even taking back to like Martin Luther King was absolutely hated. You know, like back at that time, and it was like, and was targeted, and like it's kind of just like the precursor, because after 9/11, like we, right, the proverbial we, United States citizens, clamored for it, right? We, you know, like it was us having to take off our shoes and belt and literally watching Muslims and Sikhs getting taken away into the back room in the airport. Like, that made us feel safe. So it was like, you know, like that was like a response to the cry for security. And, you know, amongst of other things that came along with that. And yeah, I don't know. And like you said, it's extremely dangerous, you know, when it could pull from someone who is challenging the state to just generals, like literally just everyone.
Right. And, you know, it's interesting because 9/11, this trial was held post 9/11, just post 9/11. So imagine you've got Imam Jamil, and he's clearly openly an active Muslim. He's a leader in the Muslim community. I mean, it played a big role in his conviction. To get a fair trial at that time, it was not likely. So, yeah, it all ties together. But you know, you see things unfold, and you see the surveillance of the Muslim community. And, you know, the Council on American Islamic Relations does a lot of work, you know, trying to protect Muslim rights, but the surveillance is appalling. Yeah, it's appalling. So, and then when you actually find out, you know, who the people are, who the informants are, it's just, I have a lot of sad moments. Like some things I just wish I didn't know, you know, and it's disheartening. And you go to law school and you think, I'm going to fight for justice, and there's this balance of power. And then you get to reality and you're like, oh, it almost feels like none of it's real. It's just this story that they tell, and it's not really how it plays out in real life. So it's shocking to the conscience. And I hope that those people who, you know, are committed to upholding the Constitution, and, you know, when somebody violates somebody's constitutional rights, I hope those people don't get burned out and keep the fight going, and keep the hope going and keep the hope alive. It's sad.
Well, what does it say when we currently have the political trends in this country where we have whole regimes of states, governments, and even federal governments who basically believe that constitutional rights and constitutional law is only important when they work toward their political benefit. They should be thrown out the window if their political opponents, if you will, are trying to exercise them. So it becomes to a point where these laws are only significant if you have the muscle to actually make them effectively applicable.
And here's the question to the panel: does the left have the muscle, financially, infrastructure-wise, to truly challenge this push that we're getting to? We're going, as Pascal talks about, the 50-plus year counter-revolution. Here we are in 2021, after our colored president. We are fighting for voting rights that we should have. We're still fighting the same housing battles that we were fighting before redlining. So I'm asking the question. I don't know.
Honestly, I think right now, like, the left can get something trending online. Like, that's like, I'm sorry. Like, that sucks. But like, I think that's like where, like, if you say, hey, how, like, when the left flexes its muscle and fucking swings as hard as it fucking can, what is the damage? Something trending.
Well, my position is that there is no left in America. We have leftists or progressives or whatever that means, but there is no actual countervailing force or people with political will that influences the way in which the ruling classes shapes policy in this country. It doesn't exist. We haven't had that in over 50 years, going back into the 60s. And, frankly, we just have a bunch of people who are, we have some organizers.
And so I'll say this too, is like, I don't want to try and, like, there is a role for social media, especially in movements. Getting things to trend is an important piece to a broader movement. But as of right now, yeah, like, in seriousness though, that's like, collectively, when the leftists get together and say something's important, then they can get it trending. And like, well, my example would be either Neera Tanden not getting onto the what was it, for the budget, the White House budget director.
Yeah.
I think possibly getting Rahm Emanuel taken off of his ambassadorship. Like, this is the limit, right? We can possibly maybe get some of the worst ghouls to not be in positions of power for a Democrat. Like, that's the limit where we're at, from my assessment.
I mean, let's go to abortion rights, which has been a fight for decades. This isn't a new thing. And now it's hitting the news. But I would say 2 years ago or so, there was a real interesting set of stories that were coming out of people getting charged, women getting charged with, maybe it was a year ago, with like manslaughter for accidents they had while pregnant, car accidents, falling downstairs. One woman got shot, but she was in a fight, and she was the one that got charged, and then there was a big pushback. And
I remember that one. I remember that case. Yeah.
And that's the one that made maybe the most national news, because that was the most outrageous that you heard. But there's states that have insane laws when it comes to women's reproductive rights.
The overall reality is that the pendulum is swinging in a reactionary direction, where, frankly, the basic understandings that people have had over the last 50 years in terms of what is permissible under the law is going to be changed relatively drastically. And if we see another reactionary right-wing administration, I think it's going to be a wake-up call for a lot of people in terms of how far that goes. And people will say, well, are you saying America is going to fall into fascism? Why does it have to be fascism to be as bad? It doesn't have to be Hitler.
It'll be avant-garde fascism, like we talked about the other day.
It doesn't have to be Hitler and Mussolini to be bad.
What's scary to me is I don't want Maha to be an outlier when it comes to the way we look at law and lawyers. And
well, she's an outlier already.
Yeah, I think that's we exist there now, right?
We need more though.
Yeah,
if we really want to combat. Where do people think they're getting these lawyers from?
I mean, that's like, it's just something that's true. Like, I think the profession of law is, you know, I'll say it's like different. It's like, oh, you're like, I don't think you're not going to like, don't join the U.S. military thinking that you're going to change it from the inside, right? You'll get ground up and spit out, right? But like the practice of law is something that like you need people who have the skills on your side. It's no different than saying like, when we start up our commune, you need a farmer, right? You need someone that's good at agriculture. Yeah, exactly. But guess what? We're not on the commune. We're in society.
I asked Flint Taylor. We were off air. Flint Taylor was one of Fred Hampton's lawyers, Miss Maha. And we were off air and we were talking. He very, 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 really nice man. He actually came back on the show. Really liked Flint. And I said, do you think you could do now what you did then, being that y'all didn't pay a lot of money for law school, cost of living was way different in 1965 and 68. Could you just up and go down to Chicago because you guys saw some wrongs that were going on and be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to be the legal team for this movement. Can that exist for somebody that actually teaches in law school, that understands what student debt looks like for a lot of people that maybe do want to be the next Flint Taylors and the people's law firms? How realistic is that we can do that again?
Okay, so, you know, don't be fully discouraged. There are plenty of attorneys in the legal profession that actually love justice and love to advocate and love cases like this. These are cases, you know, everybody has their calling, right? Mm-hmm. And you're going to get that case as an attorney that's going to be like, oh, no, do or die. I'm not getting off this. Like, this one hurts too much, or this one's personal. Like, I can't walk away from this case. You know, it's not just this case. Like, I do it for survivors of sexual violence. I do it. There are several cases that when I get them, I'm just like, I can't let this one go because there's something about it that hits my soul different, right? And everybody has a different purpose, a different calling. So in this journey, there are so many, like we have attorneys that are working on this, Christopher Thomas. We have, there are the attorneys that are working this case are committed to it because they have a different belief and they're just appalled by what has happened. So there are great attorneys out there. There are still attorneys who see injustices and say, no, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to fight for this. I mean, the Innocence Project, when I was in law school, was this little small, project, and look at what it's become. That requires a visionary. So you can't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged from going to law school. I know behind the scenes, we had this conversation before. Don't be discouraged by feeling, out of place in law school because you might be different than the majority of the population there. Fight your good fight. And as, coming from a different background, I'm not driven by money. Like, I'm driven by justice. I'm driven by righteousness. I'm driven by, okay, God tells us that we must advocate against injustice. We must help the oppressed. That's what drives me. Everybody has a different drive, but, like Imam Jamil, it's all, for me, it's like this internal revolution. If I stay silent and there is oppression, if I stay silent and there is injustice, even in the face of fear, I cannot remain silent. My duty and my existence is because I have to speak out against these things. So there are plenty of attorneys out there, and there are many Muslim attorneys who feel the same way, that we're driven by our faith, not by financial gain. So don't lose hope.
Well, I can't. And I apologize if I get a little too doom and gloomy sounding. But I do think there's a realization that we need to have, that because there's a fetish. I can't talk. There's a fetish.
Say it again.
Try. Go ahead.
Fetishization.
That's what I'm trying to say. Of that era, of the Black Power, civil rights era, and sometimes there's some context that's missed. And if you want to have some of the same things that these guys had, which is again like lawyers that are working for not a lot of money to sit there for years to make sure you don't spend time in prison, to make sure the movement progresses.
Yeah.
You don't get another Clarence Thomas, so you get another Thurgood Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
There's infrastructures that have to be built to counter a far right infrastructure, especially in the legal world. Again, these lawyers are being picked. Amy Comey Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh,
and yes,
come out of nowhere. Coke money runs long and it runs deep.
I mean, you're talking about things like the Federalist Society, which started in the 80s to try to make sure that the reactionary right, basically had a foothold in the terms in which lawyers and judges were chosen. You can go back to the Powell memo in the early 70s when the reactionary right really tried to start to configure itself to be a political bulwark against the progressive move in American law in the early parts of the 50-year counter-revolution. And, the conservatives are well organized, they're disciplined. And one of the consequences of believing in their ideology is that they believe that they are there to preserve these institutions, when many people on the left believe that our only function is to critique or tear down or deconstruct these institutions because they're innately oppressive. And the question then becomes that, is the project of people who call themselves leftists to build anything or just deconstruct everything that exists in society? And I think it's easier to get people interested in building a just society than simply talking about deconstructing everything that's wrong in the current society. And I think part of the problem is that we don't have progressives or leftists or whatever term you choose that are interested in building a project that tries to transform this society into something just, because when you talk about that, they'll say, oh, you're just a reformist. You're not a real revolutionary. What is revolutionary about giving people a quality of life, about people making people's lives under a system where they can be, treated fairly and justly and have housing and able to feed themselves and be able to live with a modicum of dignity and self-respect, as opposed to being crushed by the economic and social order and powers that be regularly. We have a super chat.
Oh, yeah.
Philip Kuhnleif's thesis is that internationalism failed due to the lack of accountability of the international organizations. Should our efforts for justice be mostly limited to within nation states for this reason? That's a very interesting and provocative question.
Great Britain.
I think I don't know what's like the saying of like what think globally, act locally, or some shit like that gets tossed around like that. But I think people just have to understand, something that Maha said, like when you're talking about like you're gonna find something that you're passionate about, and we should let our ideology guide us through our passions of whatever that is, right? And so like I am mostly, I guess, interested in government, politics, bureaucracy, but and I allow my ideology to guide me through, how I, deal with all of those things. And so yeah, like at the end of the day, I think for the left in the United States, like we're not going to anytime soon, like really bring down American empire. I think one of the most important things for the left in the United States right now would just say, how do we actually mitigate the damage that our empire does to the international community, especially the international left community? And so that's kind of a way where it's I guess 2 birds, 1 stone. You're doing things in conjuncture, but like you can act in models where it's greater for the benefit, the benefit of like the movement overall, but also, you're working in an international nature.
Good answer, Mark. Mark is coming with the deep thoughts, man. See that owning a cat thing. There's a correlation to that.
Well, let's hear what our guest has to say about that.
No, I'm learning from you all. I'm listening to you all. Go ahead.
What do you have to say, Pascal?
That's a deep. I like the question because it makes me think. That's why I like the question. It's not. I don't have a 5-minute response to this. Well, shout out to Burahave for the question. I think that justice is a product of a domestic and an international fight. That you can't neglect one for the other. But saying that all politics is local is that you should start where your pillow lies in terms of trying to address the justice that you are trying to get for yourself and your community, but you also should not neglect how international forces facilitate the reality in which you live, because your taxpayer dollars are going to be used to justify sending soldiers to countries in the world that oppress other people. Or perhaps your ability to get certain food is going to be based on the international relationships we may have with countries in the global south, to our south, like Latin America, South America, and our capacity to treat them fairly. Do you want your security and stability as an American citizen to come at the expense of the well-being and livelihood of someone who is your neighbor as an international force of being, as a country, as a nation state, simply because you believe that you are the center of the world or the center of empire, or you believe that you are quote unquote in the greatest nation of the world? What kind of sense of justice is that? Is there a possibility of being able to have a sense of balance where you balance your personal needs for fairness, equality, justice, quality of life, food, housing, shelter, good education for your children, and not having to trample on the rights of people in Latin America, South America, in Canada?
See, and
in the Muslim world, in Africa, in third world countries. Is it really impossible to envision a world in which we can try to stop exporting oppression and importing extracted resources from people who are weaker than us as nations? Is that something that has to be so impossible?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's not. It's just not sexy. It's just not clickbaity. Because if you want
to, for me, I think that part of the problem, right, is that I don't think that people are innately evil or necessarily innately good per se. I think that people are subject to the propaganda that's put around them that creates a certain echo of what is acceptable thought. And people are socialized to look at the world in a certain way that makes them think that things are okay. Listen, today is September 11th. I remember what it was like to be in South Florida in a Muslim community on September 11th and seeing people and literally having to tell people that, listen, life is not going to be the same for us in this country ever again. I'm letting you know, this is a game changer. And realizing that there are people whose lives were destroyed, innocent, good, upstanding citizens who, because of their faith, their lives were destroyed because of something that had nothing to do with them in a different city, and they were targeted perpetually. I remember I know people who literally had themselves shut down, but that's not how the average American thinks about September 11th. Think about going to your place of worship, for those of you who have places of worship, and literally every week seeing a different FBI agent interrogate your minister, your imam. Imagine what that feels like. That was a regular part of the reality here. So again, do I think that means that Americans are evil, demonic? No, I think that we live in a society where people are propagandized to create a social worldview, ideological superstructure, as we like to say. that makes them feel about the rest of the world in a way that centers themselves and how they view the world today, as opposed to seeing themselves as part of a human project. And that's a problem. How do you change it? That's not something that's going to be changed with some slogan that says, like up with hope, down with dope, or that cornball.
Yeah. Well,
you have to start asking, like, what kind of television do we watch here? What kind of video games do we play?
Yes.
What kind of messages? I was in a car with my mom yesterday, and my mom is, a devout Christian. She knows I'm a Muslim. She listens to these like Christian rock statements just to say she's and I mean this Christian rock is like, oh, whatever. I'm just listening.
Praise and worship music.
Praise and worship. And they're coming out with some hardcore. Oh, what that was? Whoa. Someone just like called me on Skype out of nowhere. I'm like, what the heck is that? But
Deep State's calling.
It's the FBI. Hey, shut up.
Now, can you stop, please?
All of a sudden, they start talking about, these socialists and this and that. All this red baiting stuff. And I'm like, this is hilarious because my mom.
Right after you were bathed in God's love.
Yeah. My mom, who is, a devout Christian, was also a lifelong member of the 1199 Nurses Union and happened to have socialist politics. She loves our show. But again, you can't get your particular religious perspective if you're of that faith. You're a quote-unquote evangelical Christian, without having you get politically propagandized to say an economic model that's interested in caring for the well-being of everyone in society is somewhat not in line with God. And my mom doesn't believe that because my mom actually has socialist inclinations. But again, this goes to show what are people being filled with in this country? What are people being propagandized with? Why do we view? Here it comes. Why do we view Why is it that when I watch an NFL football game, I've got to see 15 different advertising commercials or place settings for the military-industrial complex?
Because you're proud to be an American.
Here it comes. My position is not saying that you should. I'm not telling you should hate America, love America. That's this is your country. You love the country. That's fine. But why should you loving your country be based on believing that everyone else's country is for your foot to trample on?
God bless America and nowhere else.
Yep.
You don't remember that Chris Rock made a movie called Head of State where he was the accidental president. He was an alderman in in New York somewhere, and the vice president's plane blew up, and or the president's plane blew. Some shit happened, and so the vice president was going to win, but they needed an opponent, so they just picked Chris Rock. The deep state just picks Chris Rock out of the blue, and he ends up winning. You don't remember it? Bernie Mac.
That movie. Yeah.
And that was a line that the guy running for president, the incumbent, kept saying, "God bless America and nowhere else."
Yeah, it's funny though. It's funny you say that, Jason. But like sometimes you feel like that's the message.
That is the message.
What, America first. That is the message.
God bless America and nowhere else. Everywhere is a backwards country, especially with you Muslims in it. Right?
Yeah.
Latin people don't know how to get shit together because they have backwards governments.
Venezuela, of course.
Oh, God, Venezuela. Oh, geez. Isn't that the messaging?
Well, that's a large part of the problem. That's a large part. We're not socialized. We're not socialized to believe that people in other parts of the world are human beings, and that once you remove the humanity of a people, of any peoples, that's a recipe for genocide, man. That's it.
Pascal, human history shows that over time, groups of people are dehumanized to justify behavior all the time. This is not new. This is something from the beginning of time. So I kind of sat back to listen to you all, but the bottom line is, like, I'm from the international community, I travel. I make sure my children see the world to break down these barriers to gain an understanding of like humanity, that we're not different. We're all humans. We may speak differently. We may have different traditions. We may have different beliefs. But at the end of the day, at least from my faith process, you have to, again, it goes down to the basics. I'm not going to advocate for one group and against another group. What is justice? What is the right thing to do? We cannot justify sacrificing a group of people. What is the justification? And at some point, as a nation, we have to get this right. I mean, we can't sugarcoat the fact that this country was built upon genocide and the enslavement of Africans. That's our history. That's the reality of our history. This other story that they tell our children is just not the reality of the circumstance. It's about dehumanizing group after group after group, whether it was in the beginning European immigrants, dehumanizing them, and then that wasn't in favor of moving forward. So, okay, let's humanize them and dehumanize the African population. I mean, it's just this constant dehumanization. You see it all the time. You dehumanize, if we're at war with a nation, you dehumanize the people of that nation, because then it's okay to see what's happening. Well, they're not as good as us anyway. And I'm not sure who plays God and determines who's worthy of living more than another group. But at the end of the day, for me, I struggle now voting. I struggle because every bomb that's dropped on innocent women, children, men who have nothing to do with what's happening in the world, I have to answer for that because I voted for the person who okayed that. So I take this very seriously. It cannot be, we do what's in our best interest as a nation. No, we are all intertwined. Like, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? The human race is connected. And if it's okay to dehumanize a group and to justify genocide of a group, then what's the next group that you're going to dehumanize and commit genocide against? And we live in dangerous times. It is very normal and very easy to dehumanize a population. You give a narrative and people eat it up. And I'm not sure what the solution to that is, but the bottom line is there will never be any blessings in just advocating what's good for us and saving us. No, we have to make decisions based upon what's best for humanity in its totality. Because now we're facing, global issues, environmental issues. This is now turning into survival. And if everyone is on this, save my group and I'm more worthy of living, you're going to see some disastrous outcomes.
Well,
Nigga, what? Oh, sorry. Wrong button.
And I think this conversation takes me back to the statements that Malcolm X made after Kennedy's assassination, and saying that the chicken's coming home to roost. And my reaction is that all of the internal division, political rancor, the whole paranoia and fear, all of the adverse political feedback that we're getting in this country today, for me, is partly kind of the chickens coming home to roost of all of the energy that we've been sending internationally, we've been sending amongst ourselves, politically, otherizing other groups, otherizing other people, oppressing people internally within our country. All of that whole toxic concoction of political reality that I've seen for a large part of my lifetime in this country is creating an internal blowback in which we're seeing things like people trying to stop people from voting, state legislatures. We're seeing things like people more concerned about controlling a woman's right to choose than feeding the people, more interested in her having the baby than her capacity to feed the baby after the baby's born.
Yeah.
So the question, I think, and not to be overly dramatic, is that this country is at a point of existential reflection in which something has to be done to change the path, and business as usual is not going to do that. But unfortunately, I don't think that the political powers that are vested in this system are interested in reflection and positive development to better humanity, I think that they're going to go with balkanization and division, and things sadly may get worse before they get better. And
Division,
that's disturbing.
Empowered, Pascal division, like that whole divide and conquer. That's not just, it's cliche, but it's not. It's what keeps the status quo. So yeah, worse before it gets better. Do you want me to answer this question that Francis posed?
Yeah, I wanted to before we go. Definitely wanted to answer this question. Has the movement for Jamil attempted to cultivate champions in the National Press Corps or even in Tucson to keep the heat and light on?
Yeah, so Tucson is an interesting place if you've never been there.
I've been there. It's really hot, especially right now.
It's really interesting, that place. Oh my God. Okay, so we were just there. We just did a press conference in Tucson because, like I said, Imam Jamil was blinded. And, we had filed pleadings and demand letters were sent out. And I just got to the point where we were just like, you know what, we'll do a press conference in front of the prison. We ended up, for security reasons, they got a little upset about our location and we moved it to the federal courthouse in Tucson. But we did have a press conference and we did show up in good numbers in Tucson. We wish the numbers were a little higher. But at the end of the day, I guess the short answer is yes. But the problem is, even when you get the media who wants to cover it, and there was media coverage at the event, for some reason, it doesn't get posted, or it'll air and then disappear, or it's kind of interesting how this thing works. So we do try to get coverage, and initially when this case was hot in 2000, CNN and those news stations did try to get the story, but again, it kind of fell through the cracks mysteriously. So now it's just a matter of, you all spreading the word and doing podcasts like this and using social media. And every once in a while, I think Al Jazeera did a piece with Kyrie and that went viral. So there are moments that we have. But it ties into another question that went down as far as the Muslim community and their involvement. Again, remember, this case was post 9/11, and there are either consequences or threats to consequences or the use of fear to hinder people from getting very, very involved in this. So there are people who have been involved throughout the years. Maurice Alakhan wrote the book to try to, educate people on the case. And there are people who are involved. Obviously, we would like people to be more involved. And I wanted to find the comment. There was one about the Muslim community and not being involved in the African-American Muslim community. Does anyone see that comment? If you see it, can you post it for me so I can properly respond to it? The bottom line is this thing has layers, This isn't like a case that is the immigrant community versus the African-American Muslim community. Imam Jamil was loved by the immigrant community. There's no question about that. The immigrant community loves Imam Jamil. The Muslim community, the national Muslim community, are they kind of divided a bit? That, the Arabs are in one section, the maybe Pakistani, Indian populations in another section, the African-American Muslim population is in another section. Yes, but do they unify also? Yes. Can we do better at that? Absolutely. But I don't gauge that there's this anti-African-American Muslim community situation going on. I think this is bigger, this is deeper. I honestly, even from the African-American Muslim community, wish that there was a little bit more support or a lot more support for Imam Jamil. So without saying too much of what goes on behind the scenes, but I don't know if I answered the question. Did I? I'm
impressed that you're going back and reading old questions and being able to give answers.
Yeah, I was trying to make sure that I was, if anybody had a question, I answered it. But yeah, we do try to engage the press. It's not always successful. And you have to be careful because, they clip your words and what you say and what they portray as what you said. I'm kind of hesitant when I deal with press. Kyrie's really good at it, but
fair enough. Fair.
I'm a little cautious.
It was, I think it was like the El Quds was a Palestinian who has been on a lot of the shows recently, but he's, I think, a fantastic job because, like you said, like the framing of the question a lot of times can set people up. You know, it's like, so like being careful around the media is pretty important, because it has to be this way of like you literally have like 10 seconds to like try and reframe a question into reality, or at the very least some type of positive light for whatever you're advocating for, and then answer, you know, I guess whatever question they actually ask. But it can be tricky, especially when you're like dealing with people who have already, like, the state has made them a pariah, right? So it's like you're already sticking kind of in the hole of like public perception. But I do wonder though, if like, if there is any of like the kind of the backs of like George Floyd and all these things that with like Black Lives Matter, you know, if there is like any type of like, you know, availability for a resurgence of like, or at least like a refocusing, you know, in the national press. But
yeah, I mean, BLM and several organizations, it wasn't just Muslim organizations, came forward and came through in Tucson. And of course, right now, all their names are escaping me. But there was a lot of support. And, you know, what I'm seeing is a consistent, oh my God, I didn't know about this case, or who is H.Rap Brown, or we never even knew this was happening, or we're in Tucson and they don't even know that he's there. The Muslim community in Tucson was not aware that Imam Jamil is incarcerated in Tucson. I mean, basics, you know? And there's a reason that he's all the way across the country and not in Georgia, where he has family and counsel and, you know, the support of the community at large. There's a reason. So yeah, I mean, we are mobile in Tucson. We're hoping that he gets transferred to Georgia, or at least somewhere closer very soon. And that's kind of what we're working on now. So if there's anyone who has any ideas, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, go to freeimamjamil.com, send that letter out requesting his transfer. That'll help us.
Pascal, do you have some parting words for us?
Well, Sister Maha, I think you really, to use an urban colloquialism, you rocked the house. You rocked the house today with your presentation on Imam Jamil Al-Amin's case in terms of updating.
Thank you.
And updating our audience with the case. I would hope that you were found our participation satisfactory, and that you know, the fellas here on our Saturday free show didn't annoy you so much that you wouldn't come back on another day as a guest to talk about a variety of other subjects that you're qualified to do. Perhaps Islam through the eyes of a Muslim woman is something that we might have you talk about, you know, a variety of things. But, you know, I really, really appreciate you coming out. You're definitely one of the most important voices we have in the South Florida Muslim community, and phenomenal person overall. And I hope you guys appreciated Sister Maha Elkollali, Esquire, and what she contributed to the This Is Revolution podcast.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on.
No, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. This was actually a lot of fun. So, and thank you for bringing light to this issue.
Everybody wants to have Sister Maha back, man. They want her back on.
I can dig it.
Oh, thank you for the love.
Because she killed it.
Oh,
She
I appreciate
knocked it out of the park.
Thank you.
Here it comes!
Oh my God!
Oh my
But
God.
I would like to volunteer the left flank platform. We got this like little, you know, Twitter thing. But yeah, like I said about, you know, left getting things viral, like this is actually something that like we can do, right? This is doable. Making this story more popular and just being able to get some public perception change on that is doable. So
because we need these victories to build momentum.
Yes.
Because one thing that I'm getting tired of is the constant critique of defeat. And every time there is any sort of even small victory, then that has to be, underscored with why it's not victory enough. To free this man is massive. Because you're not only going to get people involved in the movement to free him, you're going to get people involved in the movement. Maybe I should too become a lawyer. Maybe we do need to look at some of these laws and try to change some of these laws, like the 1968 Riot Act, the H.Rap Brown law, if you will, that should have been brought up during January 6th. This man has a law named after him.
Yeah,
because there is a law.
In a bad way. In the bad way.
And I will add this as well, because we always, again, the left loves to talk about the military spending bills and never really talk about the things that get pushed through in certain bills. Again, this law that we speak of got pushed through in the housing legislation, the 1968 Fair Housing Act. That's how the H.Rap Brown Riot Act gets pushed through. If you look back in the late aughts, you'll see a lot of lending deregulation laws got pushed through in military spending budgets increases. Why all this is important.
And This is Revolution podcast is not only interested in freeing those who are oppressed by the legal system, but we definitely care about our Black political prisoners and all the political prisoners. Free them all. Give them justice. Free them all.
Because we have to ask the question constantly, what does justice look like?
It's a bouncing ball.
And on that note, I will leave with some words from the man we're speaking about today, Jamil Al-Amin.
The Prophet ﷺ has said, never petition Allah for armed combat, but when it comes, be patient. Never petition, never pray to Allah for armed combat, never pray for war, but when it comes, be patient. And so therefore he gives us those tools that enables us to practice sabra, to develop sabra, prayer, fasting, charity. There are conditions in which Allah says we are to go to war, and when they fight you because of your faith. And the rule of self-defense. So therefore, terrorism does not fit within the guidelines of what Allah has given us. It is not throwing a bomb in a theater. It is not that kind of thing that he exemplifies by his way. That is not war. So when we become serious, then we begin to understand that Allah has made war permissible under certain circumstances and conditions. And until those conditions are met, then we cannot be successful in war, nor can we wage war. Regardless of what we feel has happened to our ancestors and our families, and all of the other kinds of associations that we feel that we have that justifies us to do the actions. The man had told his son that the lion was the king of the jungle. So the son, as he got older and began to read, questioned his father. He says, "Father, you told me that the lion was the king of the jungle." He says, "But yet in every story I read," he said, "man always kills the lion." His father looked at him and said, "Son," he said, "the story will always remain the same until the lion learns how to write." When Muslims begin to tell their own story, when Muslims begin to use the Quran and deal with the character in which Allah says is a character of righteousness as opposed to a character of wickedness, when they begin to identify Pharaoh as a character as opposed to an ancient figure, when Islam becomes real to us, when we begin to practice in a manner that is pleasing to Allah, it will eclipse any lie that they will put out there.
They won't be able to tell people what Muslims are because Muslims will represent what Islam is. But this is only based upon practice, for Allah says He will not change the condition of people until they change that which is in themselves. We're not so much outnumbered, we're out-practiced.